Good evening, good afternoon. I appreciate so much the opportunity again to be with you. It's always just such a treat to be able to speak and to join your service. I always appreciate the opportunity I get to proclaim the gospel. So thank y'all so very much. Love being with y'all. Um, what's so amazing about this great book that we have, the Bible, is it when you open it up, everything points to Jesus. When we open it up, we should always look for Jesus. Jesus is in the entire Bible. He's from cover to cover. Jesus is in Genesis 1, and he's in Revelation 22. From the very first page in the Bible, the first page of Scripture, when it says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." What does John tell us? In the beginning, that Word who created things was Jesus. And at the very end of Scripture, the very last verse of the Bible, Revelation 22:21, the grace of our Lord Jesus be with you all. It opens up with the power of Jesus, and it ends with the grace of Jesus. And everything in between is telling us more and more and pointing us more and more to Jesus. And so what I want us to do today, just for a few minutes, we're going to look at the story of Queen Esther, and we're going to look at seeing Jesus in this story. And what's interesting, though, is that every time we see Jesus in a story, we also see us. If you recall, it's been some time. If you recall, last time I spoke about David and Goliath, and are we David? Well, in some ways, we could be David. We need to be more like David. But in that story, no, we are not David. In that story, David's Jesus. Where are we? We're the ones who's hiding, waiting for our Savior to show up. So we're going to look through the book of Esther, and we're not going to look at everything, but we're going to look at a few things and then make some brief application here at the end. The book of Esther is very unique. It's one of those books that records how God deals with the Jews after their 70 years of captivity in Babylon. But specifically, though, Esther deals with the vast majority of Jews who decided to stay in the land of their captivity. And Esther chapter 1 opens up with this Persian king, and it depends on what translation you use. You're looking at, depends on what he's called. I'm going to call him King Xerxes because it's just easier to say, to be quite honest with you. But he reigns all over the known world at the time. He is the man, and he has a queen. His wife, her name is Vashti, and the king has this grand, elaborate banquet, this 6 month party. And really, when you read it, and especially there in verse 8, it's really just a big drinking party, is what it is. He doesn't even put limits on how much people uh, can drink. And there down verse 11, he's had a lot to drink himself, and he summons his queen to him, and he wants the queen to be brought in, and he wants everybody to pretty much just gaze upon her and just to look upon how beautiful she is, and that he's just going to parade her around in front of people, as horrible as that sounds. But the queen, she refuses. In verse 12 there, the king gets mad, he gets angry, and he starts talking things over with his advisors about, hey, what should I do? What can be done? What should be done about the queen? And his advisors tell him that look, you've got to do something about this. He says that if not, and again, I'm kind of paraphrasing in some way, is if not, women everywhere, they're going to begin to despise their husbands, and eventually they're going to start treating us the same way. We can't have that. You got to do something. And verse 18 says there will be no end to their contempt and anger. So they convince the king to put her away, and he does. But the king Xerxes, he even goes one step further there in verse 22, and he sends all letters to all parts of the empire, to each province in its own script, its own language, and he proclaims that every man should be the ruler of his own home and should say whatever he pleases. If you want me to stop the lesson right there, we could, and just leave it at that. But I think it's probably a good idea if we continue on. Chapter 2, the king starts to feel a little bad, a little sad maybe for casting Vashti out, and he kind of misses her. But his advisors, who are always full of great ideas, it appears, they say, well, hey, don't worry, we're going to find you a new wife, we're going to find you a better wife. And we won't go into what they do to find these women. They have all these beautiful young women brought in, and long story kind of short, it's kind of just one of them is going to be his queen. And it's pretty much just like a beauty contest. And one of the young women who was brought to him was a Jewish girl named Esther. And she's being raised by her uncle Mordecai, and we'll see more of him later. And Mordecai, he's an awesome guy. We'll learn a lot from him. Mordecai tells us something very interesting. He says that you need to hide the fact that you're Jewish, and that'll come back to play a little bit later. And she does. And in verse 17, King of chapter 2, King Xerxes, he meets Esther, and he is just smitten. Of all the women, he has a lot of women, young maidens to choose from. He sees Esther, and he is just in love. In verse 17, it says, and the king loved Esther more than any of the other young women. He was so delighted with her that he set the royal crown on her head and declared her queen instead of Vashti. So he sees Esther, he's taken with her, and immediately that's who's going to be my queen. Mordecai, things go well for him. He actually becomes a palace official. It was interesting, one day while he's on duty, so to speak, he overhears some of the king's eunuchs devising a plan to assassinate the king. And so he tells his niece, he tells Esther, the new queen, and she goes and she tells the king, but she gives all the credit to Mordecai, and that'll come back later in the story. And the king finds out about all their plan to kill him. Obviously, he's not happy, as you can imagine. He has the two men taken outside, and they are impaled on a sharpened pole. In chapter 3, every story has to have an adversary, so to speak. And we see ours here in chapter 3. In chapter 3, we meet Haman. Haman is the opposite of Mordecai. He is not a nice guy. Actually, he's pretty evil. Haman is Satan in our story. Haman gets promoted to the most powerful office in the kingdom. And in fact, he's so powerful that all the other officials, they have to bow down to him when they see him. But here's where it gets really interesting. And in our story, Mordecai refuses to bow down to Haman. Now, who does that remind you of? All the God's people who are held captive. Doesn't it remind you of the three guys in the furnace in Daniel chapter 3? Does that remind you of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who were told to bow down in front of King Nebuchadnezzar, and they refused to? Very similar to that story and this story, that there's other officials who notice this, and they take offense to it, and they keep asking Mordecai every day. He says, why are you disobeying the king's commands? But yet Mordecai still wouldn't bow down. So they go to Haman, much like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who have people sort of go and tattle on them. They go to Haman, they say, hey, are you going to tolerate this from Mordecai? Are you going to put up with this from him? Chapter 3 and verse 5, it says, when Haman saw that Mordecai would not bow down or show him respect, he was filled with rage. He had learned of Mordecai's nationality. He had learned that he was a Jew, so he decided it was not enough to lay hands on Mordecai alone, but instead he looked for a way to destroy all the Jews throughout the entire empire of Xerxes. Can you imagine that? Hating someone so much that you not only do you want to just destroy him, but you want to destroy his entire family, his entire race. So Haman devises this evil plan to rid the nation of the Jewish people, not just one man, not Mordecai, but all of them. Chapter 3, verse 8, it says, Then Haman approached the king Xerxes and said, There is a certain race of people who are scattered out all over the provinces of your empire. They keep to themselves, they separate from everyone else. Their laws are different from ours, from any other people, and they refuse to obey the laws of the king. So he tells him, he says, not in the king's interest to let these people live. He said, if it pleases the king, he says, issue a decree that they will be destroyed, and I will give 10,000 large sacks of silver to the government administrators to be deposited into the royal treasury. Just here, if you allow me, I'll deposit some money into your bank account, so to speak. If you'll just allow this decree to go out, that they should just be all destroyed. Does that remind you of anything? Another time in Scripture where people spend silver to destroy someone. The king agrees, and he gives in to Haman. So a decree is sent out all across the land. It wasn't immediate, though. It would take some time before this was going to happen. In chapter 3, verse 13 says, dispatches were sent by swift messengers into all the provinces of the empire, giving the order that all Jews, young and old, including women and children, must be killed, slaughtered, annihilated on a single day. This was scheduled to happen on March 7th of the next year. The property of the Jews will be given to those who killed them. What's interesting is once the king of Persia issues an order, it was their law that he can't take it back. So chapter 4, Mordecai learns again of what is going to happen, and he is just beside himself. He's so distraught. He tears his clothes, puts on burlap and ashes, a sign that he is just in mourning. He goes to the gate there, the palace, and Queen Esther, his niece, she gets word that he is there, and she gets word of what kind of shape he's in. So she sends one of the king's eunuchs out there to go see what's wrong with Mordecai. And Mordecai tells the eunuch, he says, get this message to the queen, that she is their only hope, that she is their people's only hope. And she has to talk to the king, and she has to beg for mercy, and she has to plead for her people. This message gets delivered to Esther, but she sends one back there in chapter 4 and verse 11. All the king's officials and even the people in the province know that anyone who appears before the king in his inner court without being invited is doomed to die unless the king holds out his gold scepter. And the king has not called for me to come to him for 30 days. So Mordecai gets the message, and he sends one back, and this one's very important. Verse 13, it says, Mordecai sent this reply to Esther. Don't think for a moment that because you're in the palace that you will escape with all other Jews who are killed. If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place, but you and your relatives will die. This is very important right here. He says, who knows if perhaps you were made queen for just such a time as this. Mordecai says, he says, hey, we know the prophecy. We know that the Jews are going to be delivered by someone. And if this goes through, God's going to find a way to have his people delivered. But if you don't do anything, your lineage, your relatives, your family, we will all die. Mordecai says something that's just so profound. It just sticks with you. He says, what if you were put here as queen for this very purpose? What if this is the reason that you are here? And these words are powerful. And Queen Esther, she hears these words. She takes them to heart. Verse 15, she says, Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai, Go and gather all the Jews of Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will go do the same. And then, though it is against the law, I will go in to see the king. She says something very profound. If I must die, I must die. So Mordecai went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. Can you picture her hearing? Can you hear her saying that? She says, I don't care if I die. I'll do it. I'll sacrifice myself. Can't you see Jesus here? Can't you see Jesus is in some ways Esther here? Can't you see that Jesus in the story, that Esther is the only one who can save her people? Wasn't that Jesus? So in chapter 5, the queen, she goes to the king and she takes the risk. And it says on the third day of the feast, Esther put on her royal robes and entered the inner court of the palace, just across from the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing there in the inner court, he welcomed her and held out the gold scepter to her. So Esther approached and touched the end of the scepter. Well, the king loves Esther very much. And the king asked her, "What do you want?" He said, "I'll give you, ask anything, and I'll give you up to half of my kingdom." Does that not remind you of something else? When Herod, when his stepdaughter would dance for him, "I'll give you whatever you want, even up to half my kingdom." And Esther says, "I just want two banquets, two private ones, just two private banquets. The first banquet is just for her, for me, the king, and I want Haman to be there." And she says, "I'll tell you about the second banquet later." So this is what chapter 5 is all about. They have the first banquet. Esther says, "Hey, let's do the same thing tomorrow." And Haman, he leaves this banquet. Haman leaves this banquet. He's there and he leaves it on cloud nine. Think about Haman. He's second in the kingdom. He's about to wipe out his mortal enemy, and not only just his enemy, all his enemy's family, his lineage, and everybody who's been ever associated with him. He's going to wipe all of them out. He is so happy. But as he's leaving the banquet, he sees Mordecai just sitting at the palace gate. And what's interesting, Mordecai doesn't look nervous, doesn't look scared or anything. He's just sitting there. Look at verse 9 of chapter 5. It says, Haman was a happy man as he left the banquet. But when he saw Mordecai sitting at the palace gate, not standing up or trembling or nervously before him, Haman became furious. However, he restrained himself and went on home. Then Haman gathered together his friends and Zeresh, his wife, and boasted to them about his great wealth and his many children. He bragged about the honors the king had given him and how he had been promoted over all the other nobles and officials. And Haman added, and that's not all. He said, Queen Esther invited only me and the king himself to the banquet that she prepared for us. And she has invited me to dine with her and the king again tomorrow. And he's on cloud nine because of all this. And I'm so special and I'm doing all this and I'm so great. I'm so grand. But look at what he says here in verse 13. That he added, but this is all worth nothing as long as I see Mordecai, the Jew, just sitting there at the palace gate. So Haman's wife, Zeresh, and all his friends suggested, set up a sharpened pole that stands 75 feet tall, and in the morning ask the king to impale Mordecai on it. When this is done, you can go on your merry way to the banquet with the king. And this pleased Haman. And he ordered the pole to be set up. Can you imagine being so filled with bitterness and hate that even though that he was going to this banquet, they had just had a banquet with just him, the king, and the queen. He's going back to another banquet the next night. He says that it's all worth nothing because Mordecai is just sitting there. Can you imagine being filled with such bitterness and so much hate? It's a good lesson for all of us. But he said it's all worth nothing. Bitterness and hate is always worth nothing. But in chapter 6, the king has a very hard time sleeping that night. And so he has one of his servants bring in the book of the history of his reign and wants to read to him about his reign as king. And during that, though, what's very interesting, he's reminded of that plan to assassinate him. And he's reminded that Mordecai was the one that tells it, and that Mordecai is responsible for saving his life. And so it's very interesting. The next day, the king is talking to Haman, and he asked him, he says, hey, what should be done for someone who has been so good to the king? What has been done to someone who he trusts, someone who has just been so good, who's so awesome? He said, what should I do for that person? And well, Haman thinks about it. He says, well, who else could it be? Well, so it has to be me, right? I mean, I've just had this one banquet. We have another one tonight. And well, it has to be me. Here's what Haman says there in verse 7 of chapter 6. He says, well, if the king wishes to honor someone, he should bring out one of the king's own royal robes, as well as a horse that the king himself has ridden, one with the royal emblem on the head. Let the robe and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. Let him see that the man whom the king wishes to honor is dressed in the king's robes and led through the city square on the king's horse. Have the official shout as they go, this is what the king does for someone that he wishes to honor. And the king says, great, that is exactly what I want to do. He says, I want you to do the exact same thing, but I want you to do it for Mordecai. Can you imagine how Haman felt, and how he probably just feels so humiliated? But he does it. And he tells his wife, and she says something very interesting in verse 13. When Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends what had happened, his wife advisors and his wife said, since Mordecai, this man who has humiliated you, is of Jewish birth, you will never succeed in your plans against him. It will be fatal to continue opposing him. You cannot continue to do evil. You will never win. Does that not sound familiar? At the trial, at the rest, at the mock trial of Jesus. So the king's eunuchs show up and they take Haman to this second banquet. In chapter 7 here is this second banquet, and the king asks Esther what is her request, and here's what she says. And here in chapter 7, starting verse 3, here's where everything starts to all come together. And bear with me for a second. Chapter 7, verse 3, Queen Esther replied, if I have found favor with the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my request, I ask that my life and the lives of my people will be spared. My people and I have been sold to those who would kill, slaughter, and annihilate us. If we had merely been sold as slaves, I could remain quiet. That would be too trivial a matter to warrant disturbing the king. Who would do such a thing? Verse 5, the king Xerxes demanded. Who would be so presumptuous as to touch you, this woman that he loves, this woman apparently that the rules don't apply to? She can go and talk to him whenever she pleases. Who would do this? Esther replied, this wicked Haman is our adversary and our enemy. And Haman grew pale with fright before the king and queen. And the king jumped to his feet in a rage and went out to the palace garden. You can imagine Haman, this happens to him, and he's just turned white. He's just turned pale. I cannot believe that she said this. I cannot believe the king knows my plan. Haman, however, stayed behind to plead for his life with Queen Esther. If anybody's going to save Haman, it's going to be the queen. For he knew that the king intended to kill him. In despair, he fell on the couch where Esther was reclining, just as the king was returning from the palace garden. Talk about the wrong place at the wrong time. But the king exclaimed, will he even assault the queen right here in the palace before my very eyes? And as soon as the king spoke, his attendants covered Haman's face, signaling his doom. Then Harbona, one of the king's eunuchs, said, Haman has set up a sharpened pole outside that stands 75 feet tall in his own courtyard. Matter of fact, he intends to impale Mordecai on that pole, the man that saved you from an assassination. So the king said, then impale Haman on it. So verse 10, they impaled Haman on the pole that he had set up for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided. Look, Haman is Satan. Haman is the Pharisees. Haman is anyone who lets bitterness and jealousy and hate and rage rule their lives. And sometimes Haman is us. But here's the problem: that decree has gone out. Chapter 8, and we're almost done. Chapter 8, on that same day, King Xerxes gave the property of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, to Queen Esther. And Mordecai was brought before the king, for Esther had told the king how they were related. The king took off his signet ring, which he said had taken back from Haman, gave it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed Mordecai to be in charge of Haman's property. Then Esther again went before the king, falling down at his feet and begging him with tears to stop the evil plot devised by Haman against the Jews. Again, the king held out his gold scepter to Esther. So she arose and stood before him. Here's the problem: the king's already signed this decree and it cannot be undone. He can't go back on it. But here's one thing the king does do. He says, I can't really change what's been done, but I can make a new decree that says that every Jew has the right to defend themselves. In verse 11, the king's decree gave the Jews in every city authority to unite to defend their lives. They were allowed to kill, slaughter, and annihilate anyone, any nationality or province who might attack them or their children and wives, to take the property of their enemies. The Jews didn't seek out people to kill. They were just able to defend themselves against anyone who would want to destroy them. What's amazing is that they were successful. They were not harmed. So what do we learn from this story? Let me tell you, there's so many things we could really, really dive in and really dig deep in. But to keep it very simple this afternoon for us, what can we learn? Don't let less than perfect circumstances keep you from trusting in God. Haman is there with this evil plot, and Mordecai overhears. What does Esther do? He goes to Esther and says, only you can do this. It'd be very easy to say, I can't risk it. But what does she do? She trusts God. Sometimes we're put in very inconvenient, less than perfect circumstances. And it's very difficult. It's very hard. But no matter what circumstance we're put in, we can trust God. And also don't think that a difficult life prevents you from having great service to God and his people. It's very easy for Mordecai to still a slave, still not in his homeland, still not returned to his homeland, to think, how can I serve God? But he does. Esther serves God. I know we all face struggles, and we all have struggles. And whether your struggle is great or whether it's small, it's your struggle, and God knows about your struggle, and he cares about your struggle. And I don't always understand why. We don't always understand why God allows certain things to happen. But despite whatever it is that we are going through, we can be of service to God and his people. And maybe God has prepared you for something. Like Esther, maybe you are prepared that this is the reason you're here. Maybe you are in the right place at the right time. I'll tell you what, this really tests our faith. This really shows our trust in God, that what if he is allowing this storm in our life? What if he is allowing this struggle, how great it may be? What if he is preparing you for this so that you can be at the right place and the right time to show someone Jesus? That's difficult. That's hard. And let me break it down a little more personal. I think all of us have someone in our life who has either never known Christ, never been immersed into his death, to his burial, into his resurrection through baptism. Or maybe they have, and they're like that prodigal who's walked away and who's left. We all know somebody who we want to to bring to Christ or to bring back to Christ? What would you go through for them to see Jesus? What would you go through for them to be brought to Jesus? Would you go through a struggle? Would you allow God to place you in a struggle if it meant that they could see Jesus? That's tough. That's difficult. I understand. And the last point in this lesson's yours. God is always there, even if you don't see him. And we talked about Esther, Mordecai following God. Well, you know what's very unique? What's so unique about this book of Esther? Where is God in this story? He is never mentioned on the page by name, but he's all over the page, isn't he? God was working the entire time. Maybe some of us think that God isn't there. We think that God is somewhat retired. He's just sitting back waiting. No, let me tell you, God is active and he is there and he is working. And maybe, who knows, maybe he has purposely brought you into a situation or brought you into someone's life so that someone can see Jesus in you. Let me tell you, God is alive and he is working. And one last thing, I mentioned about seeing Jesus, and I think that's kind of obvious. We can see Jesus in Esther. We can see Jesus in Mordecai. We know Haman's Satan. You know, it's easy to place ourselves here in this story, isn't it? Sometimes we can be Esther. Sometimes we're Mordecai, and yeah, sometimes we're Haman. But is that really where we are? Look in our base text that was read for us, verse 15 of chapter 8. Then Mordecai left the king's presence, wearing the royal robe of blue and white, the great crown of gold, and an outer cloak of fine linen and purple. The people of Susa celebrated the new decree. The Jews were filled with joy and gladness and were honored everywhere. In every province and city, wherever the king's decree arrived, the Jews rejoiced and had great celebration and declared a public festival and holiday. And many of the people of the land became Jews themselves, for they had feared what the Jews might do to them. That's me. That's me. That's us. That's you in this story. I was on the outside looking in, not a Jew by birth, not part of God's special people. Remember, to the Jew first, then the Gentiles. The Gentiles see what's happening with God's people in the New Testament. They see that. They say, hey, I want to be a part of that. I didn't go out and save anyone. I didn't go out and rescue anyone. I didn't. Jesus did all of that. He did all that for me. And when we're baptized, isn't that when we're immersed into him, we become Jews? We want to become Jews ourselves for what? For fear of what might happen, for a fear of an eternity in torment and a fear of eternity where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. People feared not being part of the Jews. Do you fear not being a part of God's people? And maybe there's someone listening who you've never been immersed into his death, to his burial, to his resurrection, to one day your resurrection. Maybe you've not allowed his blood that he shed on the cross to cleanse you. You don't have to be afraid. Simply submit, be obedient to him in baptism, and start your walk. Become a disciple. Maybe there's someone listening who you were once part of God's people, but for some reason you've left. Don't you fear not being a part of that again? Don't you fear not being a part once again of God's special, chosen people? That's where I see me in this story. At one point, just afraid of what might happen. So, like the prodigal, I came to my senses and I came back home. So as God puts you in a place, someone can see Jesus. And are you part of God's people? And if you're not, why not? That's your lesson today.